Orange-pilled people. Yeah, I've got a next question for you. For our next panel, the U.S. Constitution and Bitcoin, are you kind of interested to hear what they have to say? Yeah, me too. So I'm grateful to introduce to you partner at Hogan Level and chair of board of advisors at Galaxy Digital, Mr. Neal Katyal. And next, head of legal in North America for Crypto.com, Mr. Justin Wales.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I want to give special attention to the man sitting next to me, who is the former Solicitor General of the United States, a partner of Hogan Levels, a renowned Supreme Court advocate. And my first question for him is probably what everyone has on their mind. What the heck are you doing at a Bitcoin conference?
So first of all, thank you for having me. I know this is the lawyer panel, but we'll try and make it interesting. We're not going to be your usual boring lawyers. So I'm actually a Supreme Court lawyer, actually a little by accident. I was a law professor at Georgetown in constitutional law and criminal law. I was writing articles on cybercrime. I was like the first series of articles on cybercrime. And then I just, President Bush did something that really outraged me. He set up these Guantanamo military tribunals. And he basically rewrote the entire law and created a legal black hole. And I was so outraged, I decided to file a test case against it. I wound up representing Osama bin Laden's driver. And I brought the case all the way to the Supreme Court. It was my first Supreme Court argument. Everyone thought we'd lose, and we won. And that then embarked me down this path of being a Supreme Court lawyer. And basically what I do is I try and look for places in which a story isn't being told well, I could tell it better, and in which the public sentiment right now is questionable around something, and there's a way to tell that story, not just to courts, but to litigators to make it better. And I've done this on gene patents and voting rights and the Affordable Care Act and all these different things in which I create this long-term strategy about how to think about something. So I have this nonprofit which does that, stands up for people's individual rights, and one of the main funders is, one of the main funders is a guy named Mike Novogratz. And Novo and I started talking, not just about all the work we were doing in criminal justice and other things, but about crypto. And I realized same kind of thing applies there, in which there's a story, particularly around Bitcoin, but more generally, that I think needs to be told. There's a legal architecture that needs to be developed and thought about in a responsible way. And that's why I'm here, because I love Bitcoin. I love all of you. And you guys see something really important. And I want to help tell your story. And I want Galaxy Digital to help tell the story that needs to be told.
What about the Bitcoin story do you think is not properly understood by the judiciary, the legislature of our nation?
All of the above. I mean, I don't think that right now Washington, where I live, has a handle on how important these technologies are to our economy, to national security, to individual freedom and individual rights. I think that they view it instinctively as they just got to say no. It threatens a lot of existing arrangements and institutions, and that in Washington is, of course, the kiss of death. On the other hand, I feel like the community sometimes advocates for no regulation and for a hands-off approach, which I also don't think is sustainable. So I think we want to think about how to do this in a long-term sustainable way. I've been thinking a lot about how in the law we sometimes can win too much. By asking for too much and actually winning, it can set the cause back. So I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of the George Floyd murder. I'm one of the special prosecutors in that murder against the 4 cops. And the whole name of the game, we have public sentiment on our side, obviously, but the whole name of the game is to make sure we're responsible in our wins. Because if we win on something that is tenuous, and then at the Court of Appeals, they say, hey, that's wrong, prosecutors, you shouldn't have won, the case is not just thrown out, we can't prosecute again because of the double jeopardy clause of our Constitution. Similarly here with Bitcoin, there's a double jeopardy problem. If we push for too much, win too much early on, I'm worried that that's not a long-term sustainable solution and will invite entrenched interest to backlash.
So let's dig into that, because I think early on, these types of conferences, the question was, will the government ban Bitcoin? And I think we have completely, passed that question. And now it seems, we had the executive order, we had Janet Yellen just the other day talk about, a recognition that this is all here to stay. There seems to be two specific attack vectors that are in play. The first is privacy, and the second is regulations around proof of work, around mining. And I want to kind of address each. So the first is privacy. We're all talking about code. I heard code as speech. What do you say? Is that an overstated argument or oversimplification of where the law is right now?
On privacy?
On privacy.
Yeah, so look, I think to think about constitutional backstops to avoid crypto regulation is in general going to be really hard. Look, I'm a constitutional lawyer, I love it, but the reality is when you say something is unconstitutional, you take it off the table in a democracy for government regulation, government lawmaking. So take, for example, one of the cases I had called Citizens United. That's a case in which the Congress, in a bipartisan way, said we're going to regulate campaign speech so corporations can't give unlimited amounts of money. The Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional. It violates the First Amendment. So that means we can't actually have campaign finance regulation over corporations. That's a really tough position to be in a democracy. In general, we think that our elected representatives, for better or worse, are going to regulate a particular space. So whether we think about privacy, or whether we think about the First Amendment and free speech, or whether we think about due process or equal protection, which I think are the four kind of main constitutional categories, I'm worried in saying the government has a constitutional backstop that they can't regulate against. Yes, there will be instances of that when things go too far, but for the most part, particularly with this judicial system, very unlikely to think that you're going to have a lot of success in challenging regulations as unconstitutional. There's been a little progress on the privacy front, particularly if you think about like the Bank Secrecy Act, which I know you've written about, Justin. So that act from 1970 requires banks to have all sorts of controls, know your client, and they've got to file suspicious activity reports and the like. And in 2020, the Anti-Money Laundering Act made that, extended that set of protections or restrictions, to crypto in general. And that's led, for example, to the BitMEX fine of $100 million. Now people challenge that. They say that's vague, that's a violation of our privacy. Unlikely, I think, for those challenges to win. Indeed, a court of appeals recently rejected a lot of these arguments. There are narrower things, though. If the government just has a fishing expedition against you under the Bank Secrecy Act, those might be places in which you can say there is a privacy backstop. And indeed, Coinbase, I think, successfully did that a few years ago.
Well, let me ask you maybe a foundational question on your take on Bitcoin. Is a Bitcoin transaction a purely financial transaction, a commercial transaction, or are there expressive elements to it?
There was a guy named Justin Wales who wrote, I think, the seminal piece on this, actually, and it's a great law review article, if any of you are interested in it. And I think you make the case that it's both. I think it's going to be hard to say that Bitcoin transactions are protected by the First Amendment. Now, it is true that some might be. So, it is speech. Code is speech in a way, but just being speech alone doesn't make it subject to First Amendment protection. So, Progressive Magazine wants to publish how to build a nuclear bomb and the blueprint in 1979. That's undoubtedly speech, but nobody thinks they should have the right to publish that. And I think there's other, kind of lots of different examples of when speech, speech isn't permissible even if it is speech. So I agree with you to insider trade or to conspire to rob a bank. That's speech, but it's obviously not protected speech. Now sometimes, and I think this is where your article so smartly goes, sometimes you can use code in an expressive way. Like for me, I wrote a white paper once about digital algorithm, Google search results, and how that is speech, because the algorithm itself was preferring certain conduct to other conduct, certain speech to other speech, curating it basically. And whether it was done automated or by a human, to me didn't matter much. That was expressive. I think what you say in your piece is sometimes Bitcoin operates that way. You're actually expressing a certain commitment to decentralization, to not using fiat currency. In a way that's expressive, but it's only expressive, I think, to a small point. And I think at least with these courts, which tend to be quite conservative and pro-government regulation, I think it's a really hard argument to win.
I wonder, and I won't ask you to predict the future, but I wonder what the Bitcoin network looks like 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. And as it becomes potentially a new layer of the internet and starts to adopt these new expressive tendencies, if the way to access that uppercase B Bitcoin network is through a lowercase b Bitcoin currency, if that analysis starts to change and whether we have to really look at what does the Bitcoin network allow for and what is the predominant use now versus where it can go in the future and how much we want to stifle innovation.
Yeah, it's possible, but I think just the act of wanting to join a community that has expression isn't enough really to give it a First Amendment protection, because I think the way the courts would look at it is how much of this component is expressive versus other things. And I think they're going to see it more as the other things. They're going to see it more as money and financial transactions. But I agree, look, I think these are all things that should be explored. I think my central message to everyone today is I think we need to be telling the story for why some regulation in the space is okay. Because if we don't, if we say, hey, this is all off the table, it's First Amendment or privacy or the like, I think that's an unlikely winner. And instead, we need to tell the story for why Bitcoin is so important. So, if we just take Galaxy Digital right now, we are regulated by so many different entities. I didn't even know there were this many entities in Washington, D.C. I mean, we have the SEC regulating our asset management, the SEC regulating our capital formation, our commodity pools are regulated by the CFTC, Prime Services is regulated by Treasury and FinCEN, and I've even mentioned the 20 different states that are regulating the space. And look, I'm saying we get the point of regulation, but if it's all overlapping and not done in a coherent way, my real concern is that this stuff moves abroad, as the audience here just demonstrates. I mean, Bitcoin is so international, and the United States government, and I think they're starting to get this a little bit, but needs to understand how important this sector is for our economy, for our national security, and indeed for our individual freedom.
One of the things that's interesting about the last year in Bitcoin, yeah, please. The last year in Bitcoin is we've seen a shift of miners leaving China, coming and domesticating the United States. We've also seen an uptick in criticism about proof of work and energy. A lot of it misunderstanding, I think, the realities of what it is to mine, especially with renewable energy. But are there any constitutional backstops for regulations specifically targeting energy use, specifically targeting participation in the Bitcoin network, separate from financial transactions utilizing Bitcoin?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, look, first I'll say there is obviously a legitimate piece to the ESG criticism of Bitcoin. It can be done in a bad way, it can be done in a good way. Amanda Fabiano at Galaxy is really thinking hard about this and trying to do it in the right way. And I get why governments, NGOs, and others are concerned. So I think that some attention here is really important. Having said that, I think if the government does try and regulate because of the ESG stuff, I think it's very hard to say that that's unconstitutional. The government regulates all sorts of industry, take the petroleum sector or agriculture in all sorts of ways. So there is something we have in the Constitution called the Bill of Attainder Clause, which prevents government from singling out a person or indeed even an industry for special disfavor. But it's got to be truly punitive in nature, much more akin to something criminal, and it can't be justified by some industry or person-specific problem. And so I think here the government's going to have a lot of latitude to regulate, at least as a constitutional matter. And that's why my message to all of you is, if you care about this and you're worried about onerous government regulation, the best thing to do is tell the story for why it's onerous, why it's wrong-headed, why it's counterproductive, and don't put your chits in the constitutional basket, because that's a really hard win in today's judicial system.
So I guess let's take a step back on that. Would you say that there is an associational right guaranteed by the First Amendment to participate in, let's call it the Bitcoin social network, joining a node, maybe running a mine, but likely just, participating, non-financial, just supporting the network? Is that protected as an associational right?
Yes, I think that if you're participating without more of a financial piece to it, yes, it's like joining a social club or whatever. Yeah.
So what would be the role, or let me maybe put it this way, you're hired to refute regulation on participation in proof of work in favor of something proof of stake, right? A proof of stake validation method. What arguments are you making, and are you at all addressing the Constitution at all, in court?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I'd want to think about that more. I'm not sure exactly what those arguments would look like. I get that there can be non-financial participation, which looks a lot more like conventional speech. And in that place, I'm likely to say, hey, there is actually a constitutional argument there. That's interesting. But I think for what lion's share of what people are concerned about is obviously also the financial side, or a mixed dual use. And it's in that space that I think the government is going to have more zone to regulate. Now, having said that, we've only been talking so far about the constitutional backstops. There's also just statutory ways in which, so just ordinary laws and how they're being interpreted that I think are stymieing Bitcoin and more generally the crypto community. So take, for example, this question about what is a security. Now, Bitcoin, the SEC has said, doesn't have to worry about it, but basically everything else is governed by this 1946 Supreme Court case about orange groves. I mean, it's completely outdated, and the way in which it's thought about by many people in the government is outdated. So one of my tasks at Galaxy is to think through what that long-term litigation strategy looks like, so that we can make sure that the government, while deeming some things appropriately securities, isn't throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So applying the same kind of techniques we did to Guantanamo or the Affordable Care Act or gene patents in this new space of this question about what is a security. And so while I'm down on courts, you've heard me be down on courts on some of these constitutional challenges, I'm absolutely optimistic that if the government continues to take some very broad positions about what is a security, that we can win in the courts on that.
Well, so let's maybe dive into that just a little. What is the role of decentralization in the Howey test, and how do the courts need to adapt to that? Because we have this Hinman presentation from several years ago, which basically introduced a very vague standard of sufficiently decentralized. How does one determine whether something is sufficiently decentralized? And also, it seems to me that nothing is decentralized until it is, right? It's not a binary idea. How can the courts grapple with that binary idea? Is there a safe harbor, like Hester Pierce has suggested, that you would recommend?
Right. So I do think, one, I would love to see the SEC come out and create a safe harbor, because doing it in courts, the problem with court adjudication is it's so incremental. It's going to be fact specific. And one of the things we're trying to do is think through what's the right first set of facts to bring to the court. And so to me, one of the big areas is, it's not a security if it's consumptive. If there's some purpose that you can use beyond simply as what would look like otherwise like an investment. So if you take something like helium, for example, in which it has an obvious use case, even to old judges who barely can use the internet, they can understand that if you buy this token, it's going to have a consumptive purpose above and beyond any speculative ability. As you get further, in your question about decentralization, as you get further into it, it's hard to think that litigation alone is going to provide the kind of clarity we need, which is why I do think Pierce is right to say let's have a safe harbor that's general and speaks in broader terms than any one case. But we're preparing for at least the possibility that that doesn't happen out of Washington, and that we do need courts to start clarifying things. And so you try and architect a strategy taking a case with good facts and trying to draw broader principles from that about consumptive purpose, about decentralization.
Well, we have about 3.5 minutes left. We have a new Supreme Court justice from Miami who was just confirmed yesterday. What's your take on the makeup of the current court and where they would come out on these types of arguments?
Yeah, so shout out to Miami girl Ketanji Brown Jackson. It's historic, it's awesome. I clerked for Justice Breyer, as did she, and now she replaces Justice Breyer, and she is loved by the Breyer family. And she's going to be an extraordinary justice at a very difficult time for the Supreme Court. So, I've argued 45 cases there, started my first case on Guantanamo in 2006, and I have to say this court is the most conservative court in our lifetimes by far. And indeed one of the most conservative courts in United States history. And I say that having supported, many of them, including Neal Gorsuch, to the Supreme Court, but it is really much more conservative than the Supreme Court we've grown up with. Now, what does that tell us about Bitcoin and the Supreme Court? Well, I think this is a court that generally isn't that familiar with technology. When I clerked on the Supreme Court in 1996, I was the only person who had an internet connection in the building. I had an America Online laptop with a dial-up connection, and the justices, we had this big case about the Communications Decency Act and regulation of pornography. The justices all hunched over my computer to use the web for the first time. So it's really, it's changed a bit, but it's still pretty unfamiliar with this. So I think they're going to have an instinct to go slow and be cautious and not to mess things up. And I think that's generally good news. So in that sense, they're conservative. They're being prudential, careful. When it comes to technology, they're ones who don't want to announce broad holdings because they say industry is doing this, the government regulators are doing this, who are we really to get in the way? And I think a little bit more of that judicial humility is needed on the regulators in Washington.
Yeah, great. So maybe I am going to ask you to make a slight prediction. At its core, I view Bitcoin as a democratic tool. It is, in my view, expressive in that it says that we, as a community, want to opt out of a system that is governed completely by federal monetary policy. It has, and we've seen this in Ukraine, we've seen this elsewhere, the ability to save people from tyranny. Yeah. Is there a path with responsible regulation where we can keep these fundamental principles without throwing away the baby with the bathwater? We start to regulate it so much that it essentially just becomes a very, easy tool for the state to control and for it to just essentially become a light CBDC.
Right. Nobody wants that. And I think those use cases you talk about Ukraine, or I think a lot about Afghanistan and the ways in which Bitcoin's been sent to them, and 88% of people in Afghanistan having smartphones, which enables them to have Bitcoin transactions, and NGOs even using the Lightning Network to get money to people. I think all of that is so important. I do think there's a way in which you can have some modest regulation without throwing out what is the essential promise of Bitcoin, which is to be decentralized enough to provide individual freedom in our transactions to people. I think both can happen.
Well, amen to that. That's all of our time, but thank you, Neal, for taking the time. Yeah.
Welcome back to Bitcoin 2022 here at the Miami Beach Convention Center. I'm your host, Nolan Byerly. I host a daily show on Bitcoin Magazine called The Breakup. Please subscribe. We got, canceled last night, and the more subscribers we get, the harder it is going to be to cancel us. Now, I was a lawyer at one time in my life, or played one on TV, and what I just saw from another lawyer got me real perked up, energized, and a little angry. But I don't think it got me as angry as my friend Jimmy here, who I have to give the floor to first, because there was some triggering going on, real triggering.
This is why I hate lawyers. No offense, Nolan, but I hate lawyers for this reason. This was lawyer masturbation, okay?
Whoa.
That's what they were doing. They were just continuously thinking about what regulations exist, thinking nothing about the actual rights of the people, instead saying, well, this regulation exists and this might happen, and this, it's not at all about what we have the right to do. It's okay, well, these things exist, therefore we have to comply to them. We have to submit to the state. This guy is an altcoin apologist at the core. He's trying to figure out ways to argue that things are decentralized enough. I'm sick of people like this. That's why I hate lawyers. I hate them.
Well, what I saw was a lot of, let's call it word thinking, as if the words you use define reality, right? And that reality is perhaps beyond the mere words you string in order. A bit like why, law is code, and then they think just like a computer that sets out a protocol, you're bound by it. Well, law is not really the same kind of code. It's just words that go in your brain, and words that I did hear on ESG, words you don't normally hear on this stage at all. ESG, Marty. I heard ESG a lot there, and when we talk about reality, defining, energy bills are one way to find out what is real and what isn't. What did you hear from his speech on the ESG piece?
Well, I mean, it's typical catering to a narrative that is not based in reality. Like you said, it's just words. They use words like sustainable, green energy, renewable energy. We're for social justice. We're going to save the world. But at the end of the day, they're hypocritical. These people don't care about social justice at the end of the day. They don't care about the environment at the end of the day. What ESG is about is control. And that's a lot of what was just discussed there, is how can we work within the framework of the legal system in the United States to make sure that they don't ruin Bitcoin for us. And like Jimmy said, I think that's a bad framing. We should be attacking. He mentioned the Bank Secrecy Act specifically. That's something that should be abolished. The Bank Secrecy Act thrust a dragnet surveillance system onto the financial system in the 1970s to prevent money laundering and crime, and it has not done that at all, objectively. People who want to launder money or commit crimes are still doing that, and yet the everyday common man is put in significant amount of risk because of all the data they need to give up because of the Bank Secrecy Act. We shouldn't be talking about how to work within the Bank Secrecy Act. We should be, as an industry, trying to figure out how we can abolish the Bank Secrecy Act.
Yeah, and I think you're onto something here, because look what we've already done. Apparently there is no money laundering in the world because they don't actually prosecute or catch people with the existing laws that they have. It gets even worse. It looks like we sacrificed Hong Kong as Western worlds to this exact law because the excuse for deportation was from FATF. When FATF took control, it was their turn in the shared presidency of it. Gave Carrie Lam, the Hong Kong governor, her talking points to say this is why we need extradition to mainland China because of the potential money laundering liability. Now, I want to ask Preston about this, just because what I saw with that word thinking, not questioning whether laws can change, is, let's say, missing the real point here, that this is a change that goes beyond the words that we put in our brain. It's a change that almost comes from the show that you hosted the night, thank God for Bitcoin. And what I saw there was someone who just didn't acknowledge that the force behind this goes beyond the plans of all this, legal stuff. And the real piece that I wanted to ask you about was, federalism. He kept going on to the U.S. Constitution. U.S. exists within states. It exists within other pieces. And, tell me if you saw a part there where American federalism can come and play a role.
I just look at it, you can get caught up in all this fancy jargon and terminology, but at the root cause of it, from a first principles thinking kind of way, you can implement as much policy as you want. You can put all these different restrictions on it, but you're just doing it to yourself. It's the equivalent of me living in a neighborhood and saying, well, we're only allowed to park one car in the driveway, right? And all of you are going to obey that same policy. And everyone's just looking at you like, no, dude, that's you who's coming up with that policy. I'm going to do whatever the hell I want, right? And so you're going to see that game theory play out on a global scale, that you can become as constrictive, you can read into whatever legal jargon you want, but at the end of the day, you're just going to be doing that to yourself. And you're going to see other countries that are going to get out of the way, and you're going to see the Bitcoin flow straight into those jurisdictions, right? So we can get as fancy as we want, but I think at a first principles level, it's get out of the way, watch the Bitcoin flow into that nation state, and it's going to be extremely beneficial for those citizens.
So it's a think for yourself situation.
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
You heard it here. Think for yourself. We'll be right back with an announcement from BitPay. Thanks. See you later.